If you're enjoying the Health Geeks Book Club podcast, we'd appreciate if you hit the subscribe button, leave a like, rating, or review, whichever your preferred podcatcher platform allows.
This episode is sponsored by Well Balanced Nutrition and 360 Health.
Hey guys, this is producer Tim. Kristen and Eleanor are taking a much-deserved break and catching up on new health books to review and talk with you about. In the meantime, we're going to replay some of Kristen and Eleanor's faves. Let's call this a Redux. This week we're revisiting episode 39, Essentialism, The Disciplined Pursuit of Less by Greg McKeown, Part 2. Enjoy. Welcome to the Health Geeks Book Club podcast. Listen in as Kristen Norton and Eleanor Russell review all those great health and wellness books you've been wanting to read or you have read and want to talk about. Here's Kristen and Eleanor.
Wow, Kristen, what happened to you?
Well, what kind of question is that?
Well, I guess it's one that we're supposed to learn to ask. And I kind of like, we found this book called What Happened to You? And Tim, what's so funny about finding a book?
No, it wasn't that. It was just, that was a great start. I didn't even know what you were talking about, and that was pretty good.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, I could have said, Kristen, what's wrong with you?
And that's what we say all too often.
Yeah. And so this book calls our attention to conversations on trauma, resilience, and healing. It is a New York Times bestseller. It was authored by Dr. D. Bruce Perry, who is an MD, PhD, and Oprah Winfrey. Did you ever watch Oprah's show?
Of course. Loved
well,
it.
I didn't. So you
Really?
did, huh? Okay. Well, you'll have some insight that maybe I didn't have. I know who she is, and I have seen some of her episodes, but I'd never watched regularly. It was on when I was involved in a lot of other professional activities and just didn't watch TV, so I missed it. What I found interesting in this book, I love that it's written in conversational form. It's not like any of the other books we've read, and the color of the ink is different. When Oprah says something, it's in blue, and when Perry says something, it's in black ink. So you're pretty clear whose experience is offering you some information.
And it was really neat to listen to the audio version.
Oh, was it? Did they both narrate it?
They both narrated it, and it very much just seemed like a conversation you were listening in. And that's Oprah Winfrey's style.
Absolutely. I mean, she's a master interviewer. And experienced. How many years did her show go? 30 or something? I mean, it was a long run.
It was a long time, yeah.
And I remember Donahue started the interview show earlier, that format of talking about, hey, what's going on in your life and what's happening with your relationships. And there's a lot of, when we talk about wellness, and, you know, Kristen and I love to talk about wellness. That's why we're reading these books. And hopefully you guys are interested in that topic too. But relationships, it seems like I run into that over and over and over, is how important relationship is. And I'm trained as an ecologist, so from a scientific perspective, that's the study of relationships in biology, in life. You know, what are the relationships between the flora, the fauna, and the in organic parts of our environment, you know, relationships. So I'm keyed in on relationships. So this book is good. Well, what I found, and I wanted to see if you picked it up on this, they're talking about all these dimensions of a relationship, and we'll get into the details. But Oprah is always using her personal experiences. And this Dr. Perry, there was one instance where I heard him say something personal. So he does not reveal any of his trauma. And she reveals a lot of her trauma.
I didn't pick up on that because he is a child psychiatrist and he shares a lot of his patient stories.
Exactly. But he protected himself in this book. So let me tell you about Dr. Perry.
Oh, please do.
Did you look up him?
I didn't.
Well, this guy is 66 years old. He was married for 1 year. And he was married to his high school sweetheart from Bismarck, North Dakota.
Okay.
Okay, so now we know that's not a really population-dense part of the country, is it?
Right.
So I'm thinking that's an interesting place to originate. And they end up at Well, okay, before that, I think he got married after he did not complete his undergraduate program. He went to Amherst. Amherst is a pretty prestigious place.
Okay.
So this guy must have been a good student. And I have not seen him, but I've seen pictures of him, and he's a pretty impressive looking fella. And I think he did tell us he's over 6'4". So I think he's
Maybe
a large
he's tall,
presence.
handsome.
Yeah, well, I mean,
And
depending on
large.
how you define that, but he is impressive. And he took courses at Amherst that he liked, but not enough to qualify for an undergraduate degree. Well, then somehow he gets into Northwestern University and studies pre-med and ends up completing an MD and a PhD. So this is a very unusual man, in my opinion. He did his residency in psychiatry at Yale, so you know this guy was sharp. Mm-hmm. And he did a fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry at the University of Chicago. So he's got a pretty impeccable academic experience. But back to this story about his wife of 1 year, and there's no other wives identified. She was murdered in the chapel, the Methodist chapel at Stanford University on the campus.
Oh my gosh.
And it was unsolved for 40 years. Can you imagine the young man who was in love? They came from this, Bismarck to California, and this love of his life is brutally murdered in a church. I mean, this is a trauma. So I always find that people study things that they have some relationship to.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And so that gave me insight into why this man has been so passionate about this. And I don't know if it's true or not. I'm just, information from nowhere. But I'm thinking that experience directed his life.
Yeah. I can't believe he didn't share that.
Well, I can.
Too.
I mean, anyway, 40 years later, they figured out who it was through DNA stuff. And when they went to arrest the guy, that guy committed suicide before they could arrest him. So this is trauma, and it's extended trauma and indefiniteness. And this fellow, Dr. Perry, was accused initially of it.
Really?
Yeah. If that's true. I got that off Wikipedia.
Wow, that
so can you believe Wikipedia?
Traumatic.
I don't know.
Well, if you use Wikipedia correctly, you can believe it if you use the citations at the bottom.
Yeah. So anyway, that's a little bit about him, and I thought, that makes this even more interesting because he went on, and this expertise he has been probably critical because he was involved in the children of trauma, let's say at Columbine High School, that massacre. Mm-hmm. He was called into the Oklahoma City bombing. He was called into the Waco siege. These are awful things that these children have experienced in our country. And he now leads the Child Trauma Academy in Houston, and he's authored many, many articles, over 200. So this is a very prolific author, and from his conversation, I think, wow. So that's what I have to say about that.
Yes.
So this is a neat book.
It is a very neat book. He's an expert, and then Oprah is an expert interviewer, and she shares a lot about her background of trauma, raised with violence and
neglect.
She was unwanted. She knew she was unwanted from the beginning. And
so she's very transparent.
Yeah.
But she doesn't load you up with that at the beginning. It just kind of is revealed as it's appropriate as we're waiting, through the conversation they have.
Absolutely. And all the stories are just kind of put in there as you're learning a concept, which I like the way they did that.
Yeah, very skilled, very skilled. To start it off with, though, since this guy is a science medicine background, she taps into his knowledge and says, okay, lay the groundwork about our brains. So, Kristen, when you think it's ready, I want to talk about that. But if there's some things to talk about before we get to that.
Yeah, I just think to set the stage, like what the purpose of this book is, to me, what stood out is that we kind of alluded to this as we opened the podcast, that we tend to look around at humans and say, what is wrong with you? Why is that child acting like that?
Oh, yeah.
What is that teenager doing? Why is that mom letting her boyfriend hit her child? And there's just so much going on in the world. And this book really allows us to look at it in a new light and from the lens of neuroscience, from what happens to the brain. So throughout the book, Oprah is reminding us, instead of saying what's wrong with you, what if we asked, what happened to you and why does that matter?
What's wrong with you? Why can't you read that book? Why can't you keep up with the classmates? Why are you not progressing in school? Why are you a discipline problem?
Right. So basically just being trauma informed and operating from an understanding of what happens to the brain when we experience trauma. So he does set up that stage. I'd love for you to walk our listeners through that, Eleanor.
Oh, yeah, and I will also say what I think he did very well is, since this is an interview and it's not a lecture, he did not go into the minutia detail of all of the neuroscience that he is obviously aware of.
That's true. It was very common verbiage that he used.
He pulled it down to something that someone without any experience could say, oh, I think I understand what you're saying.
Yep.
Rather than you're confusing me and I don't want to read that and it's too tedious. We run into books where it's too tedious for the regular reader. So he has the very first figure in here is called the hierarchical organization of the human brain. And he's saying it's important for us to understand this because our behaviors originate from the circuitry of the brain. And so we're going to look at the brainstem, which some people will call the reptilian brain. It's the area of the brain that takes care of breathing, heartbeat, those sorts of things. Critical life function is, and you don't think about it, temperature control, those sorts of things. And then as the brain develops, the front of the brain will overgrow this brainstem, and you'll get a midbrain area, and then you get a forebrain area. And so he talks about the diencephalon having responsibility for arousal, sleep, appetite, and movement. And then going forward in the brain, the limbic system, and we've mentioned this before in some of our books about the reward pleasure system. So reward, memory, bonding, and emotions are the area that the limbic system is involved with. And then the cerebral cortex is where our cognitive function originates, our creativity, our making sense of language, our thinking, our values, perception of time, and hope. So there's a connection from the brainstem to the cortex that happens because of development. And the structural and functional complexity increases from the lower, simpler areas of the brainstem to the cortex. And the cortex mediates the most uniquely human functions such as speech and language, abstract cognition, and the capacity to reflect on the past and envision the future. So that's it in a nutshell.
And if you're looking at the diagram, it's an upside down triangle where the top, the whitest part, is your cortex, that part where you can think and be creative. And the bottom is what you said, the brainstem, the reptilian brain. And so the reason they lay this out and the importance of this is they tell us we process all events and incoming stimuli from the bottom up. So from the brainstem up. And what that means is to get to the top, the smart part of the brain, we have to go through the lower, not so smart part of your brain. And that our brain is organized to act and feel before we think.
Absolutely. And so then that thing, then you say, what's wrong with you? Why can't you do this? That's sort of saying, why can't you regulate yourself? Why don't you have control of yourself? Why are you doing this? You're lashing out, you're hitting. Why? So then he uses that same upside down triangle to talk about the brainstem and the diencephalon and what he calls core regulatory networks. And so these he refers to them several times, or they both do. It's a set of neural networks our body uses to help us process and respond to stress. We tend to use the word stress in negative ways, but stress is merely a demand on one or more of the body's many physiological systems. So hunger and thirst can be a threat or a stressor, but you resolve it. It's just a signal to your brain to say, oh, you need to do something about that. So you do. And when we're looking at the brainstem, which is the bottom of the triangle, the upside down pyramid, there you have your five senses that are putting information in there, and then you have input from inside the body, the neuroimmune system, as well as the autonomic nervous system, And then as you go up through the diencephalon and limbic system, you get HPA axis, which we've talked about before with cortisol. The stress response is the hypothalamus to the pituitary to the adrenal glands, and you get this surge of hormones that then flood your body, and your cells respond to that. And it really shuts down the cortex. You don't have access to your thinking centers anymore because of that chemical thing that's going on. So the regulation comes from, the bottom. And how do you respond to stress? And the two things that I think they were helping me understand is people will respond to extreme stress with either this stress response of aggression and lashing out and, running and flaring, or they will dissociate and become very passive and just avoid, and we've heard stories of women that have been raped, and they say that they kind of go out of their body and watch what's going on. Mm-hmm. Just to survive. Mm-hmm. So these are survival mechanisms. You either fight or you retreat into the interior. And so that to me was very helpful when we talk about the rest of this.
Yeah, and basically that our life experiences can shape those parts of our brain and determine how we react to future things. Mm-hmm. And I liked the example they gave up front about the war veteran.
Oh, gosh, yeah, Mr. Roseman.
Mm-hmm. So he came to Dr. Perry and was like, what is wrong with me? I just, freaked out when I heard a motorcycle backfire. And it's been 30 years since I've been
in the
war. And here I am. What did he do?
Belly down between the cars on the street.
Right.
And his girlfriend is going, what
is happening to you? And Dr. Perry so nicely explains that, your stress response is sensitized, mm-hmm. and it shuts off the higher part of your brain. So you couldn't really think about what was going on, even though logically, if you were thinking with that part of your brain, you'd realize you're not at war, you're in a safe place. But it was just the lower part of the brain that was reacting based on his past.
Yeah, and it's that long-term effect, and that what you just said, the pattern of stress and the how it's activated. Is it unpredictable or predictable? And that the long-term effects of stress are determined by the pattern of stress activation. And so even though this thing happened to him 30 years ago, it has a long-term effect. Mm-hmm. And what this neurosequential model, which was what I was demonstrating from the brainstem to the cortex, that's the sequence of the way the connections are made from the bottom to the top. Dr. Perry's come up with a way to intervene in that, to redirect pathways so that that initial thing it doesn't disappear, but you learn to say that's not the way I need to respond. Your body physiologically can learn to do that, to put it off to the side, mm-hmm. make new pathways when you hear that explosion. Because he didn't like to go to fireworks. Remember the fireworks?
Yeah,
anything like that. And I know several people that have that issue. So that idea of relating, you have to regulate yourself, you relate, and then you can reason with somebody. And that's the way his therapy is designed, that you get the person regulated, and that then they can relate, and then they can reason it through and mm-hmm. say, I don't have to lay down between the cars.
Yeah. So speaking of regulation and dysregulation, there's a whole chapter about seeking balance and rhythm, and how those different patterns of stress, right? It could be the difference between becoming a resilient person and an oversensitized person who always kind of reacts in mm-hmm. a strong way. Mm-hmm. And that might be the person that we're like, well, what's wrong with you? Why can't you pay attention in class? Or,
oh, absolutely.
Because they were dysregulated, and now they're missing that rhythm and soothing sense. So, this, let me see, on page 62, I thought was really relevant to just health and wellness, because he talks about filling our reward bucket mm-hmm. and a lack of strong relationships and connections, which you mentioned earlier, can make an individual more vulnerable to overuse or other over drug use or other less healthy forms of reward versus a healthy combination of rewards, lots of positive human reactions, doing work consistent with your values, integrating healthy rhythms. Those can help us decrease the pull towards any single unhealthy form of reward, such as substance abuse or overeating. So it's like how we're filling our buckets. If either trauma that we were raised with is shaping our relationships, or just we're in that current
like
lack
self-sabotage,
of,
right?
yeah, or we're in a just current bad situation, we're going to try to fill that bucket with other unhealthful things. I thought that was really relatable.
Oh, yeah. I think once you kind of get their insight, you go, yeah, I've seen that. I've even talked to people with that problem.
Absolutely, all the time.
Is that kind of like the misery loves company thing? That once you start filling the bucket, you just continue filling the bucket with
maybe
more bad stuff.
Because you're not you can't regulate yourself.
Right.
And you're trying to self-medicate in a way and numb it out.
Yeah, and Dr. Perry says, even though you know better, and if you've grown up this, like, for instance, women who maybe were raised with an abusive father, then will be in abusive relationships, and better, but
it's
that's
familiar.
Comfortable and
It's
familiar,
right.
And we seek out the familiar.
Yes, we do, and we're afraid of the unknown. So at least I know the devil within. I don't know the devil without.
Right.
So I'm going to tolerate this because I at least know what it's about.
Exactly. It's enlightening, though, because again, instead of what happened to you, what's wrong with you, we say, oh, well, because this happened to you, now your brain is in this pattern.
And there's room for hope, that idea of hope.
I'm glad he talked about that in the end.
Well, this thing that causes this long-term trauma, other than the war effect that we talked about, could be things that we're now calling adverse childhood experiences or events. They're called ACEs. And once you start exploring this topic, it really is somewhat depressing because they say 60% of adults have experienced one adverse childhood event, and 20% of adults have experienced 3 or more. And these are things that have lasting effect that you may not even know are affecting you. And that's why sometimes getting into this therapy issue, you can discover these things and say, oh, that explains a lot. So, but that's a high percentage. And then they're saying that 45% of childhood mental disorders, involve a ACE. So 45% of childhood mental health disorders are contributed to these adverse childhood events. And 30% of the adult ones. So 30%, if you have a mental health issue, 30% of us would be able to track it back to an adverse childhood event.
That we might not even know about,
we might not even remember because we suppress it.
Right. But the body remembers. And
that's a book. I want that book.
The body keeps a score. Yeah. But can I share an example? A story from this book that exemplifies, like, we might not know what's going on, but our biology has changed. So he tells this story of this poor guy, I think Jesse is his name, and he experienced, a bad childhood, was taken out of his home, then went into the foster care system. And apparently they set him up with this family that had a reputation of being good with foster kids, but it was later learned that they actually weren't good foster kids, and they, what did they do? They exercised them to exhaustion, to wear them out, and it was a very abusive situation. So terrible, terrible story. But he finally got he got into a coma.
That's right. From
this family, this foster family. And Dr. Perry was told to investigate it. And this was fascinating to me. So Dr. Perry says, as part of my assessment when Jesse was in a coma, I was able to obtain unwashed clothing from his biological father and foster father. Despite being unconscious, Jesse had a notable physiological response when re-exposed to the scent of these two men.
Absolutely.
When I placed the clothing from the foster father under his nose, he started to thrash and moan, and his heart rate rose from 90 beats per minute to 162.
I know, that's amazing, isn't it?
So he, like, that's a perfect example that we might not be aware, but our bodies are responding based on our past.
Yeah, and this Dr. Perry doesn't think ADHD is a real disease, and so there are examples of children in classrooms, and the one example that story made me think of was the boy who really recoiled and did all sorts of things when the male teacher came to his desk to help him. And it would happen over and over. And so the teacher finally said, I don't like this kid. The kid doesn't like me. So, I'm not going to help the kid.
And that nobody could figure out why he was acting out.
Exactly. And that happens to so many of the stories in here about children who are lost in the system, is because they aren't very agreeable. The adults try for a while, but then it's like, I don't need to waste time on that kid. I'll spend it on these other kids. And it gets worse. It compounds the problem of rejection and isolation and stuff. But anyway, what they figured out with this teacher and student was the scent of Old Spice. And so when Dr. Perry told the teacher, change your aftershave cologne, it might help, they were able to repair the teacher-student relationship and actually make progress on the learning, because the student was like 2 or 3 grades behind already.
Yeah, and all because the Old Spice triggered his reminder of his dad.
I'm going to get hit or something, so I'm just not going to pay attention to this person.
Yeah, but the boy was totally unaware of it.
Exactly.
The teacher was the one aware of it.
Mm-hmm. And then, it's something so simple. How wonderful is it that if we could have professionals that are trauma-informed that would know some of these things, they could maybe pick up on this sooner.
It would be wonderful. Yeah. I think it's really important.
Yeah. They talk about, do you have another example you want to share? Or
not off the top of my head.
They talk about a trauma-informed society. So they do get into the transgenerational conversation that many people are having right now about the indigenous population and the African Americans and maybe the Hispanics that are coming to our country, is the traumas that they've experienced either at someone else's hands or the hands of this society are messing with their brains, and causing behaviors that may not help assimilate or have a happy life, those sorts of things. So there's a really good conversation in there about that. But one of the things that I think comes up in this regulation is, do we have self-control? When is there's a story in here about a fella that was on death row and was in isolation and could see nothing, and there was and I believe he may have been a black person who'd killed somebody, and then in the cell next to him was a sort of like a neo-Nazi kind of white guy who didn't like black people, but they couldn't see each other.
And he was in jail for hanging a black man.
Is that it? Okay. You remember this story. And the idea was that the black fella heard the other guy crying and just said, what's wrong? And the fella said, my mother died and I didn't get to go, and I loved my mother and I didn't get to be there. And since this other man also loved his mother, there was a connection. And anyway, they talked each other through it and became these companions in this, awful death row situation. And when the white fellow went to the executioner, which he did, he said, I got it all wrong. I believed the wrong story. And, there's nothing different between the two of us. And it was what do you call it? A salvation story and reconciliation and everything. And it was a pretty powerful story they shared.
Very powerful.
Yeah.
Even now, I get chills about that.
Yeah.
And
that's baggage that you're carrying from who's been around you, who's told you what to believe, and you bought it.
Absolutely.
And that happens to all of us.
And there's a whole bit in here about, what's the technical term? What is it? Implicit bias?
Maybe.
and racism. So like we might be biased and not realize it because of the generations. And we really have to be aware of that.
Well, it is a conversation to be had. But that idea comes back. The reason I brought that up was these people killed men. So we could say, well, it wasn't their fault. They killed people because their brains were hurt. So we need to let them off the hook, and then they go out and kill somebody else. So I don't know how a society. It'll be interesting to see what we do. This is the kind of a new approach to offering something into the redesign of our society, which is a conversation I hear in places. So new ideas to say maybe it could be structured better. Maybe we could do more caring things for each other. But when people hurt each other and continue to hurt each other, do we control that or not? Or do we just absorb that? Now, that comes with the idea of looking evolutionarily at what did societies do way back when they were little clans and tribes, isolated from each other. And they were obviously experiencing trauma. So trauma is not new.
Right.
The human group has always had trauma. And one of the things that I thought was well said here was the only predator on humans really is another human. We were very predatory against each other. And so these tribes would fight each other and maybe hurt each other and kill each other, and then they would go away. But there was intergenerational living conditions. So mothers of young children, and probably many children, because there wasn't birth control or anything, had the access to family people and community members to help them with that and reducing their stress. And these children were loved and taken care of in a different way. And the way we've structured our American society is we separate people. We take kids out of the home, put them in preschool, put them in school systems. We take old people out of the home and put them in retirement villages or the nursing home or whatever, and we're no longer experiencing the life journey as a unit. And so what they're saying is the traditional healing, because Dr. Perry has been all over the world talking to some of these indigenous people saying, how do you all handle trauma? What did you do? And they're saying that there are 4 basic principles, and I loved these. The one thing that'll, there are 4 sets that can kind of help heal somebody. The person has to feel connected to the clan or the family and the natural world. So in this book, they talk about take a walk outside, and haven't we said that?
Yeah,
so there's some of these health practices. There's regulating rhythm, and I feel so strong about understanding our place in nature and feeling the rhythms. And our world is tilting. We have equinoxes and solstices and weather changes and seasons, and that can be transferred into the life journey as well. But anyway, we need to dance, we need to have drums, and we need to sing. And so all these more, quote, primitive groups do those things. Now, a lot of American families do not sing. Now, I know Timothy does.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah. It's a good thing. I think you should keep doing it. And that you need a set of values or beliefs or stories. And a lot of those earlier groups were audio. They would tell stories about what life is about, and they would pass those from generation to generation. My husband was a storyteller, and you would sit there and just listen to these stories and go, oh, wow. And there are very few people around now who can, in a gathering, tell a story and have people drop their phones and sit there and say, oh, I want to pay attention to this.
That's true.
I mean, we're losing that. And then the 4th thing is to use natural hallucinogenics. So a lot of these groups would use mind-altering substances, plant-based, to help someone reconstruct their experience. And so he suggests that, interestingly enough, as more advanced we have become, maybe we're de-evolutionizing ourselves, which we ran into that word in another book too. And I thought, that's something to think about. Now, what are we doing? We think we're advancing ourselves, but maybe we're hurting ourselves.
Yeah.
So I really like that idea of looking at a more holistic healing concept to what we're doing with these traumas.
And kind of related to that, I'll share this that stood out to me. It says, your connectedness to other people is so key to buffering any current stressor and to healing from past trauma. Being with people who are present, supportive, and nurturing. Belonging.
I call that, I have a group of colleagues in one of my business venues, and we talk about the BLTs. Everybody needs a BLT sandwich, bacon, lettuce, tomato. No, not really. You need to know that you belong. You need to know that you're loved. You need to know that you can trust the people around you, and you need to feel safe. And so that's that relationship concept that they're talking about as well. And I advocate for that.
Absolutely. And one more thing I want to share before we probably wrap this up soon. Just one big takeaway, I think, for me, it kind of came up in several parts of this book, that we probably all know somebody who's gone through trauma, and we don't always know how to talk with them about that or help them best. And it was just a great reminder or suggestion that a traumatized person isn't always going to be ready to talk. And, you want to help them talk it out, but asking them to bring something up that's traumatic can also re-traumatize that person is kind of what I got from here. Waiting for them to be ready and safe to talk is important.
And they did not mention tapping in this book.
And I thought about it the whole time.
Yeah, and they talked a lot about cognitive behavioral therapy, and they talked about, it might take 26 sessions before you could really get the person to tell you or reveal their trauma. And what we were learning in that tapping book seemed to say we could reduce those numbers significantly, the time, and get an efficient response. So I would like to ask, if they were here with us today, I would like to ask them what they know about tapping in relationship to this work that they're doing.
Absolutely. And I thought about the upside down triangle and we could bring on board the upper part of the brain quicker if we tapped it out. Yeah.
And they didn't really talk about what we read in Spark about moving the body and how important that is to mental health and getting the chemicals in your body. Because, and you as a nutritionist, I feel that for mental health, you have to have a physically healthy body as well. It's not just the mind. And he does, both Oprah and Dr. Perry talk about getting the mind, spirit, body in equilibrium or balance. Balance is a weird word for me because that's like a teeter-totter. And this is more complex than a teeter-totter.
Synergy.
Yeah. But there is a relationship, and if it's, fluid and healthy, it's good. So to do that, you have to have good sleep. You have to have good nutrition. If your cells don't have the nutrients or the minerals to build the chemicals that are required for the brain to function properly, or the cells energetics to work, it's not, you won't make as much progress as soon. So I felt I wanted to hear a little more about a general wellness program in here as well for these clients that they're working with. You said something else that made me think of an idea, and I lost it.
Well, I think from my experience, you've really got to help heal the trauma before you can focus on the wellness, right? Because the trauma is going to possibly affect your sleep, and then the sleep is going to cause you some adverse effects, and the trauma is going to affect your cravings or your pull to maybe overeat or use other unhealthy behaviors. So
chicken or egg thing, huh?
And I think as a nutritionist, it's really important to be trauma informed. And at Well Balanced Nutrition, we love to work with clients who are also working with a therapist at the same time, because it takes a team often to work through that.
You were talking about how they go about this, and I found the idea. It was, I was saying it takes 26 sessions. One of the things he was talking about is you can't have an hour with these people. It might be 5 minutes, because you're going to dysregulate them, because when they reconnect with that trauma, they'll dysregulate. And so you have to let them get regulated before you can go to that relate
level
and reason. The 3 steps of the program is, get yourself regulated, then we can relate to each other, and then we can reason with each other and help each other. So he was advocating for little bursts, which I thought was novel. Instead of scheduling 45 to an hour hour-and-a-half sessions. No, we're not doing that. I'll go in, I'll talk to you. I will remove my body from the room so you don't even see me anymore. Remember, he would make excuses. I've got to go out and take a phone call. I'll be back. And then he would come back in and do another 5 to 10 minute thing and then leave again. And he got great progress with his clients this way. I thought it was really, really fascinating. Different. And I had not heard of that approach.
A different approach to building that rapport and safety with somebody.
Yeah. And then the hope that he talks about, the post-traumatic wisdom that they talk about in here. He says we can help each other heal. And you were talking about how important the connection to other people is. But often assumptions about resilience and grit blind us to the healing that leads us down the painful path to wisdom. And then they bring that back up a little bit later in the book and talk about the success of some of these people that they talked to, and that they were able to heal and they were able to develop a post-traumatic wisdom and function and have a life and have healthy relationships. So I found this to be a very encouraging book. Very interesting, very provocative. I love the way, very engaging. It engaged me the whole way through.
Yes, I think everybody should read it or listen to it. I think it's really important to understand trauma, how it changes the brain, how it can impact the way we respond to our world, respond to other people. If you're in a job that's working with people whatsoever,
absolutely,
you should know about trauma. So highly recommend it.
Yeah. So I'm Eleanor at 360healthforyou.com. I'd love to have a conversation with you about any of these books.
And I'm Kristen with Well Balanced Nutrition. Visit us at wellbalancednutrition.com. We've got lots of free stuff going on, and we'd like to invite you in. Well, thanks for listening today, and we'll catch you next time.
Yeah, think about what happened.
The views and opinions stated in this podcast are solely those of the contributors and are not necessarily those of our distributors or hosting company. This podcast is copyrighted, and no part can be reproduced without the express written consent of Kristen and Eleanor.